Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have no idea where we are.
These are probably the last words that you want to hear from your pilots, and yet a variation of this is exactly what the passengers of Varig Flight 254 got to hear. Now, what led up to this absurd situation is both a fascinating tale about the limitations of the human mind and a lesson in how not to act in a cockpit. Stay tuned. The 3rd of September 1989 was a nice and mostly clear day over central Brazil. There were only scattered clouds around, but the continuous burning of rainforest in order to clear land for agriculture was causing some localized areas of what's known as dry fog or smoke. Back then, the dominant airline in Brazil was Varig, who operated a large fleet of Boeing aircraft, including the Boeing 737-200, which was a real domestic workhorse. Now, at that time, it was still common in Brazil to operate flights in a train-like fashion by starting a flight in one city and then conducting intermediate stops at different smaller airports where passengers could either stay on or disembark depending on where they were traveling to. If you were unlucky and wanted to fly all the way to the end destination, this could mean a quite long journey, lasting the whole day, and it was in this way that Varig Flight 254 was being operated. The flight had started in Sao Paulo in the morning and then operated north up through Uberaba, Uberlandia, Goiânia and then Brasilia, where a cruise change was scheduled to take place. The flight was then planned to continue up to Imperatriz, Marabá and finally Belém, which was situated close to the Atlantic coast, next to the mouth of the Amazon River. The two pilots who were taking over the flight had been spending their time awaiting the arrival of their aircraft by looking through the weather, NOTAMs and flight plans for the coming 3 flights. The weather was, like I mentioned before, very nice, and the departure time was also quite civilized, so they were both in a very good mood as the day's duty started, and it looked like everything was going to be quite straightforward. When they looked through the NOTAMs, there wasn't many things written up, except that an NDB called CRJ, Carajás, was inoperative and had been so for the last 4 months. An NDB is a non-directional beacon and is one of the least sophisticated navaids that we use in aviation. It basically works by sending out a continuous radio signal, typically between 150 to 530 kHz, which is then interpreted by the aircraft's automatic direction finding (ADF) instrument, who turns a needle towards that beacon. It's a very crude instrument, one that can make any fresh instrument pilot start sweating when thinking about using it for holdings or approaches, but it generally does a very good job. Just like any other navaid that we use, it also transmits an identification Morse code, which we pilots have to listen into and verify before using it for navigation. And since it transmits on lower frequencies than other beacons, it has a quite long range, which can follow the curvature of the Earth slightly. But this also makes the NDBs very sensitive to environmental disturbances like thunderstorms, obstacle and the ionospheric layer in the atmosphere. Remember that. In any case, it seems like the two pilots didn't look too closely at that particular NOTAM. An inoperative NDB was not a big deal, since for the most of the 3 flights there was other, more precise VOR beacons available, and this particular NDB was not even planned to be used on any of those routes. Also, since the weather was really nice, the captain was quite confident that he would be able to navigate visually if he needed to, using the low-level navigation charge that they were carrying with them. Back in 1989, the aviation infrastructure, especially around rural, remote areas in the Amazon rainforest, was very sparsely built out, so navigating partly visually was not as uncommon as it is today. On top of that, there was also a complete lack of radar coverage for a large part of Flight 254's coming journey, and GPS was not readily available yet. It would still take several years before that would become a standard on almost all aircraft, and that's also worth remembering. Who were the pilots who were going to operate these flights then? Well, the captain was 32 years old and had been flying for Varig for the last 7 years. Before that, he had been operating for the Brazilian Air Force and had then flown on the Boeing 727 before finally becoming a captain on the 737 almost exactly 1 year prior to this flight. He had a total flying experience of just over 6,900 hours, of which 980 had been flown on the 737. His first officer was 28 years old and significantly less experienced. He had only been employed in the airline for a little over a year and had started flying on the Boeing 737 very recently, in March of 1989. Together, this meant that he had flown a little under 900 hours in total and only 442 hours on the 73. Now, it's pretty safe to say that with the strict hierarchy that existed in Varig at the time, combined with the captain's prior military background and the first officer's low experience, the power gradient between these two pilots was likely quite steep, but that was not highlighted in the final report. I should also mention here that I'm basing this story on both the final report and some eyewitness accounts, including the first officers, as the report in itself wasn't very detailed. Anyway, when the aircraft finally arrived in the early afternoon, the two pilots were ready and they walked out in order to meet the aircraft on the apron. It was a beautiful 737-200 with its cigar-shaped, low bypass JT8 Delta engines howling under the wings as it pulled up to the stand. The pilots let the passengers disembark before they entered the aircraft, greeted the cabin crew and then talked a little bit with the off-going pilots. They reported that the aircraft had been behaving beautifully and that there was no open technical issues with it. So with those good news, the pilots thanked their colleagues and started preparing the aircraft for the departure, where the first officer would be pilot flying for the first leg and the captain would fly the following two. All checks went by smoothly, and that meant that the aircraft soon took off for the first flight up towards Imperatriz and then onwards towards Marabá. These flights were reportedly completely uneventful, except that the captain encountered some difficulty in landing at Marabá due to a heavy layer of smoke that had moved in over the airport. The visibility through that smoke had been made even worse by the fact that they were landing in the late afternoon, but the sun would have illuminated the smoke at a very low angle. Anyway, they did eventually manage to land and then taxi in, and while some of the passengers were disembarking, the first officer went outside to do the walk around while the captain started setting up the aircraft for the last short 40-minute hop over towards Belém. Now, this last leg was a little bit different than the previous ones because there was no published airway connecting the two airports with each other. Airways are like motorways in the sky, and they are clearly marked out on low and high level IFR charts, which we pilots always have access to. The airways, especially back then, generally went between different ground-based nav aids, with the courses between them clearly marked out. The captain was very used to navigating using these charts, but because he couldn't do that on this leg, he instead had to look down on his flight plan, which also included the courses between the different waypoints. In this case, he was especially looking for the first magnetic course to follow after departure. And here we come to one of the first clues of what caused this debacle. You see, Varig had only a few months earlier started operating aircraft with an autopilot system that was able to accept heading data with a precision down to 1/10 of a degree. The Boeing 737, however, could not do that, but to keep things common across the fleet, the airline had started issuing flight plans with the courses depicted as a 4-digit number instead of the standard 3 digits. But for some reason, they hadn't included any comma or decimal point in those 4 figures to highlight the fact that the last figure was 1/10 of a degree. And this meant that when the captain now, likely for the first time since this new format had been introduced, looked down on his flight plan to find that first course, what he saw was 0270. This was supposed to mean 027.0 degrees, meaning a north-northeasterly track to follow towards Belém, but it's quite easy to see how it could be interpreted as 270 degrees instead. So without thinking more about it, the captain set a bug on his horizontal situational indicator, HSI, of 270 degrees to remind him of what course to follow after departure, and then he just continued with his setup. Now I'm guessing that quite a few of you are right now spitting out your coffee. Because even with a very limited knowledge of navigation, most of us knows that 270 degrees is a straight westerly course, and that would make absolutely no sense if you're intending to navigate towards a destination up in the northeast. But this is nonetheless exactly what happened. After this, the next thing the captain needed to set up was a relatively new system of the 737, known as the Performance Management System, or PMS for short. This was a crude predecessor to the flight management system, designed to help optimize the aircraft's flight profile based on performance data and the distance to the destination. The system would help to calculate when it was time to start descending, give inputs to the auto throttle, and inform the pilots regarding things like fuel performance, etc. But the PMS was not connected to the navigation system per se. It only counted down the distance flown from the total distance entered. So the captain entered 178 miles to the destination from his flight plan and then started his final flight deck preparation. Meanwhile, the first officer had been outside, and when he came back into the cockpit, he looked down at the same flight plan as well as looking at what the captain had set on his HSI and just copied that over onto his own instruments. Now, when you are planning to fly an aircraft according to instrument flight rules, IFR, you are required to set up the instruments so that the aircraft can be flown and navigated safely without any outside visual references. In this case, that would have required the pilots to tune the navaids that they were going to use en route, which consisted of an NDB beacon near the runway at Marabá and a more precise VOR beacon at their destination. Now that VOR at Belém might be out of range early on in the flight, but there was also another VOR close to the route at Tucurí, which could have been used as a verification. We don't know exactly what type of departure briefing that the captain did, or if he did any at all, but in any case it didn't include those navaids because they were never tuned. Instead, it seems like the captain thought that the weather was so good that it would be easy to find Belém Airport visually if he just followed his initial course. That type of navigation is known as dead reckoning and is normally used when there is a total lack of navaids, so all you really have are tracks and timings. You could maybe argue that the captain had a timing here since the PMS was primed and ready to go for him, but if you're going to do this, which is very rare by the way, you better make sure that you're following the correct track. In any case, I highly doubt that any real departure briefing actually took place, since that would have definitely highlighted the absurdity of that initial westerly track that they were now planning. But instead, the last 48 passengers were boarded, giving a total count of 54 passengers and crew on board when they finally started taxiing out for the departure into the sunset. And I will tell you all about what happened next after this. Mistakes happens, that's something that you will soon see, and that's just part of being a human. But as a pilot, I always try to look for tools and strategies to help me avoid those mistakes and make my life a bit easier. Today's sponsor Incogni is a great example of just such a tool which really works. Have you ever felt that your phone and inbox are starting to fill up with spam, phishing emails and irritating robocalls? Well, it turns out that there is a reason for that. Your data is most likely being legally sold by these shady companies known as data brokers, and it can then be used to either shadow profile you for insurance companies and banks or even be sold to cyber criminals, hence the spam. Now you can actually tell these companies to stop selling your data, but you have to do so one by one individually, which is really time consuming. But this is where Incogni really shines. As soon as you sign up, they will start to clean your data from these actors immediately, assure compliance and then keep scanning for new actors for as long as you stay with them. It's like having your own little digital army helping you out. In my case, it turns out that my data was actually being sold by no less than 66 different sites, but since I started with Incogni, the amount of spam has gone down dramatically. So if safeguarding your privacy is a priority for you, well then click on the link here below, which is incogni.com/pilot, and use the code PILOT to get started. That will give you an awesome 60% discount on the yearly plan, and you won't regret it, I promise you. My wife actually signed up immediately when I told her. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's continue. As the Boeing 737 was now taxiing out and started getting closer to the holding point, the pilots were busy completing their final cockpit checks before departure. Several of the passengers in the back were really nervous because at the same time Brazil was playing Chile in a deciding qualifier game, determining which of the two teams will get to play in the 1990 World Cup. Some of the passengers actually asked the flight attendants if they've heard anything about the score, and this was relayed to the pilots, who in turn asked air traffic control about it. Now this is something that happens almost all the time, even to this day when there are important matches being played, and ATC normally are really helpful if they have time, which they did have in this case, meaning that the pilots were able to give the passengers a match update. And this fact actually led up to one of the early theories about this accident, that the pilots were actually listening to a football game in the cockpit, when in reality they just got that information told to them by ATC, and that's what those witnesses then misinterpreted. Anyway, when we're on the topic of air traffic control, the airport in Marabá was uncontrolled, so the only ATC interaction the pilots had was with the Flight Information Service officer, who was sitting in a separate building away from the runway. He did not have any type of access to any radar screen nor any other advanced tracking equipment. Instead, his only job was to provide weather and traffic information and apparently football scores. But that meant that when the pilots were ready for departure, they informed the FIS officer, who then likely just gave them runway clear together with the latest wind information. After that, it was up to the flight crew themselves to depart by their own discretion and then eventually switch over to the Belém controller once they had gained some altitude. At time 17:35 local time, the captain first stabilized the engines at 1.4 EPR and then set takeoff thrust, which caused the 737 to start accelerating down the runway. The takeoff was completely normal, and after reaching around 1,000 feet, the captain asked for the flaps to be retracted and then started turning towards his first indicated track of 270 degrees. Given that this was now in the late afternoon, that initial track would have meant that the aircraft was turning straight towards the setting sun, glowing bright orange through the dense smoke layers. Now this should have served as a first indication that something was definitely off. Both of the pilots should have known that their destination was located to the north of them, meaning that some type of basic spatial situational awareness should have kicked in here, but sadly it didn't. Instead, the pilots just focused on completing the after-takeoff checks and continued their climb up to their intended cruise altitude of flight level 290 or 29,000 feet. As they got up over the smoke layer, the Amazon jungle started stretching out before them in the fading sunlight. As expected, the visibility was good, so the captain was confident that he would be able to find his way towards the destination visually. He looked down on his PMS, which showed that the nautical miles left to destination was ticking down as expected, and this likely just reaffirmed his feeling of being on the correct track. But remember, this PMS was only counting miles flown, not if it was flown in the actually correct direction. Now, if the Marabá and Belém nav aids would have been tuned, they would have clearly shown that something was now very, very wrong, but since they weren't, they were not of any type of use here. As the flight continued, the pilots soon did tune in the Belém VOR in order to start getting guidance towards the airport, but strangely, it didn't seem to work. This initially confused the pilots, who knew that they should now be well within range of that beacon, and they therefore decided to contact the Belém air traffic controller to check if the status of the VOR was okay. But when they did that, there was initially only static heard on the frequency. This was truly strange, so the pilots started suspecting that maybe they were suffering from some kind of radio malfunction here. They started looking at the circuit breakers, which was located behind them, but none of them had popped and everything else seemed to be working as it should. The captain then suggested that they should try the HF radio instead of their normal VHF radio, and when they did that, they finally managed to contact the Aeronautical Information Service officer in Belém. This caused some initial confusion, as this AIS officer was sitting in a separate room in the tower away from the active controllers, but eventually he managed to start relaying information between the aircraft and the actual controller in charge. Meanwhile, the pilots had continued to try and use their normal radio and had managed to get into contact with another aircraft inbound to Belém. That aircraft reported that the nav aid seemed to be working fine and that they could talk to the Belém controller without any type of problems. Obviously, this was all super confusing for the pilot, but if we look at what was actually going on here, it all makes complete sense. Since the aircraft had now been flying for over 20 minutes in the wrong direction, it meant that they were now well outside of the range of both the VOR at Belém and the normal VHF radio from the controller. The HF radio was operating at a lower frequency and therefore had a significantly longer range, which is why they were able to get into contact with that AIS officer. And the fact that they were able to reach that other aircraft was likely due to both the position of that aircraft, which might have been closer to them, and the fact that it was significantly higher up, helping to extend the range. In any case, the captain was now looking out through his window, trying to locate the characteristic bay next to Belém, but no matter how much he squinted, he still couldn't locate anything that he recognized. All he could see was the setting sun in the west and the dense jungle stretching out below them. They had now been flying for 23 minutes, and since this was only supposed to be a 40-minute flight, the PMS indicated that they had already passed the ideal point to start descending. The captain saw this and told the first officer to ask the controller for an initial descent clearance. The first officer complied and sent his request via the HF radio to the still confused AIS officer, who managed to get the confirmation from the controller that they could indeed start descending, initially down to flight level 200. This very confusing situation had also meant that there had not been any time for a proper approach briefing or verification of any other intermediate nav aids. So as this descent was now initiated, they were still essentially flying blind, and it was now also starting to get dark outside. The aircraft continued flying, with the pilots anxiously scanning the horizon in front of them for any signs of their destination, and when they looked down on their PMS, it soon showed that they should be overhead Belém, and then that they had passed it with 5, 10, 20 miles. How could this be? Maybe they had entered the wrong mileage into the PMS or something. The AIS officer continued asking them to please try and reach the Belém air traffic controller directly on the VHF frequency instead, but it was of no use. All that the pilots could hear on that radio was static and the odd call from some other aircrafts. When the PMS finally showed that they had overflown the destination by 30 nautical miles, the captain assumed that they must have somehow missed the airport, and he therefore reversed their course and started flying back the same way they had come. In order to not miss it again, they now also asked the AIS officer to relay a request to descend to an even lower altitude, down to 4,000 feet, because from that height they should definitely see the airport. Now, I think it's really interesting to see just how strong confirmation bias and denial can actually be here. These two pilots now thought that they must have overflown their destination and somehow missed it, knowing full well that 30 nautical miles past their destination, they should have been out over the Atlantic Ocean, which they clearly were not. Still, they now descended onto an easterly heading, hoping that they would be able to see the destination airport, which by all logic couldn't possibly be below them. At this point, they had also flown longer than their intended total flight duration, almost an hour into the wrong direction, and by descending down to a lower altitude, they will now encounter much denser air, which would reduce their remaining range considerably. But the captain was not worried. He was supremely confident in his navigational skills, and according to the first officer, who had now started to seriously doubt their position, the captain was also arrogant and just dismissed his concerns. At this point, they had about 1.5 hours of fuel left, which should have been plenty to get them back to Marabá, the airport that they had just left, if they would have tried. But instead of going for that, the captain seemed dead set on getting themselves and the passengers to Belém. This is something known as get-there-itis, which could have been triggered by the captain fearing repercussions from the airline if he didn't complete the flight. As they were now descending, the first officer continued trying to find something to navigate on, and he remembered that there were a couple of commercial radio stations in Belém transmitting on frequencies that the ADF equipment in the aircraft would be able to tune in. If he could find those stations, the ADF needles would start pointing towards those transmitters, and that would make them finally able to hopefully find Belém. The first frequency he tried came in just barely, with a transmission covering that football game we talked about before, but the second came in loud and clear, playing a live Sunday religious service. The frequency of this transmission should have belonged to Radio Liberal in Belém, and as soon as the signal was received, the ADF needle now started pointing straight to the south. While the first officer was fiddling around with this, the captain was still looking outside as the descent continued, and he saw a big river suddenly stretching out from left to right in front of him. Maybe this could be the Amazon. If that was the case, well, then he knew that it would take them towards their destination if they could just figure out which way to turn. And that was soon decided by the triumph of the first officer's attempt to turn in Radio Liberal. So all of a sudden, they now had both a river and an instrument pointing where to turn. So with the Sunday sermon streaming through the ADF receiver and the aircraft descending through 10,000 feet, they now turned their aircraft to the right and started following the river down towards the south. Again, here it's probably worth pointing out that the Amazon River is probably one of the most well-known features in the Brazilian landscape, and the pilots must have known that it flows west to east. So again, how would it make any kind of sense to follow a river towards the south? This is just a further example of how confirmation bias works, where only indications that confirms the bias is considered and everything else that speaks against it is ignored. It was now almost completely dark outside as the aircraft leveled off at 4,000 feet and turned to follow the twists of the river. The two pilots were anxiously looking outside, hoping that the lights of the city would appear behind every new turn, but they never did, so something was still obviously very wrong. If they had just missed and flown past the airport initially, it should have appeared long ago, as they had now been flying for almost another hour at 4,000 feet. It was only now that the first officer started to remember that the initial heading towards Belém had supposed to be a reasonably low number, meaning a northerly heading. And when he now looked outside, he could clearly see the Southern Cross constellation ahead of them. What was going on? The captain must have obviously thought the very same thing, so he now asked the first officer to find the low-level navigational chart and have a look at the correct tracks. And when he finally found it, they realized their mistake. They had been flying 270 degrees after departure instead of 027 degrees, which meant that the river that they were now following couldn't possibly be the Amazon. In reality, they were following the Xingu River, but they had no idea about that, obviously. And I can't even begin to fathom the feeling that these two pilots now must have felt in their stomachs. They had flown their airliner full of people in completely the wrong direction for over 2 hours and were now following some unknown river into the jungle as their fuel was steadily decreasing. Since they had left, they had made so many twists and turns that even if it would have been initially possible to find their way back to Marabá, now it would be close to impossible without the help of some sort of reliable nav aid. But what about the ADF and that radio signal that they had been following? Well, here this story would almost become comical if it wasn't so crushingly sad. Because it turns out that the radio signals that they had been receiving didn't come from Belém as they had assumed. Instead, it was coming from another radio station called Radio Club de Goiânia, which was using the same frequency but was situated in a city called Goiânia, hundreds of kilometers to the south. Now that station should theoretically be out of range, especially at that low altitude, but due to atmospheric conditions on this evening, the signals had bounced on the ionosphere, greatly extending their range. This, by the way, is why it's not a great idea to use signals from commercial radio stations for navigation, since it's very hard to verify their true origin. The pilots obviously didn't know that they were now tracking a false signal, but they did know that time was of the essence. They needed to find out where they were fast, otherwise they would run out of fuel before they could reach any airport. At the time they realized their mistake. They had been flying at 4,000 feet for 1 hour and 14 minutes, meaning that the total time they had now been airborne was 2 hours and 10 minutes on a flight that had been planned to last only 40 minutes. They had taken some extra fuel with them, obviously, but now there was less than 1 hour left before they would run completely dry, especially if they kept flying at this low altitude where the fuel burn was significantly higher. Now you would think that pilots in a situation like this would call out a mayday call and try to muster up any help they could possibly get, but that didn't happen. As I mentioned before, there was no radar available in the area, so there wasn't much that ATC could have done anyway, but maybe they could have come with some valuable suggestions, or at least they would now know that the aircraft was completely lost. The controllers in Belém had initiated the uncertainty phase when the aircraft still hadn't arrived an hour after their takeoff time, but a full emergency still had not been initiated. The pilots knew that they had to do something, so the captain initiated a climb to 8,500 feet in order to try and get into contact with some NDB nav aids in either Marabá or maybe in the more southern airport of Carajás. And when those frequencies were tuned, they actually did pick up signals, again telling the pilots to turn towards the south, now with only 1,800 kilos of fuel left. But in yet another cruel twist of fate, it turns out that what the ADF receivers were actually picking up here were neither of those nav aids that the pilots were hoping for. Remember, the Carajás NDB had actually been notamed as inoperative and Marabá was now just too far away. Instead, those signals belonged to NDBs in Goiânia and Barra de Garjas, who were using the same frequencies, and those signals had also bounced off the ionosphere, reaching much further than they were designed to do. Now the pilots would have known that if they would have taken the time to carefully listen to the Morse code identifiers of those nav aids, but confirmation bias is, like I mentioned, a very powerful thing, and in the situation that they now found themselves in, they likely refused to accept any indications that would counteract their own mental model of what was going on. Soon, the captain asked the first officer if he could try to locate the L3 low-level navigation chart, as he had a hunch that they might be somewhere in that area, southwest of Marabá, which was actually a very good guess. The first officer tried to find that chart, but in the dark cockpit and under this extreme stress, he never managed to find it. And that was very unfortunate, because if he would have, they would have figured out that they were actually still in range of another airport, a military base called Cachimbo, about 100 nautical miles away. But since he couldn't find it, they instead just continued on their southerly course, chasing those faulty NDBs. The minutes continued passing by in what must have felt like hours, and soon the terrifying reality started creeping in. They were going to run out of fuel and would have to make a forced landing in total darkness in the dense Amazon jungle. Now, this realization didn't cause the pilots to start panicking, nor did they start making any particular preparations for the coming crash. Instead, a feeling of resignation started spreading, and they were both heard saying things like, "May this be nothing but a dream." This clearly shows something known as disassociation, meaning that they didn't feel like this was happening or was real, or that it was happening to them, which is often the case for people that are experiencing severe stress. Apart from that, they could also be heard talking about a possible compass failure, which had caused them to make this horrendous mistake. But since the CVR only recorded the last 30 minutes of the flight, and they had already figured out what had happened well before that conversation took place, it is quite likely that those remarks were made to be captured on the CVR on purpose, in order to try and hide what had really happened from the investigators. Anyway, since a crash now seemed inevitable, the captain also picked up the PA mic and, for the first time on this very long flight, explained the situation to the passengers. Now, he obviously couldn't say that they had made a mistake, so instead he told them that they had experienced a navigation malfunction and that they therefore would soon have to make a forced landing in the rainforest. Now, the final report didn't specify how the passengers reacted to this, but according to some eyewitness accounts, two very different responses happened almost immediately. A large part of the passengers stayed quiet and softly started crying, while some joined hands in prayer, whilst other passengers instead stormed the forward galley and started helping themselves to various alcoholic beverages. This must have been a horrific situation for everyone, especially for the cabin crew, who now had to prepare themselves and the passengers for a pitch-black emergency landing in the jungle. In the cockpit, there was still not much action going on. Both pilots were looking down in horror at their fuel gauges, as they were now both quickly approaching empty. So, what could they have done here then? Well, if you know that you're about to make a forced landing, there are actually quite a few things that you should be doing. First of all, you must advise air traffic control about what you're going to do so that they can alert search and rescue resources. Then you obviously have to prepare the cabin crew and brief them so that they can maximize the cabin preparations and brief the passengers about what to do with the emergency exits and demonstrate the brace position, etc. Secondly, the cockpit must be set up accordingly, and a crash briefing should be done, including what configuration to be used, speeds to follow, and what area they should be looking for. Yes, I know it was pitch black outside at this point, but the weather was also clear, so by minimizing cockpit lighting, there was still a possibility that they could make out some features in the landscape, or maybe even aim for some lights in the distance rather than just blindly flying straight ahead. Another thing to remember is that it is always better to execute a forced landing with engine power available. That will maximize maneuverability and minimize descent rates, so that once again, the location of the crash can be more closely controlled and the G-forces minimized. On top of that, having two engines running would also make sure that all systems, instruments and lights would be available to them. So with that in mind, the best thing to do would have been to use that last bit of fuel remaining to actually land the aircraft, but that sadly didn't happen here. The pilots also never told air traffic control about how dire their situation actually was, nor about their plans for a forced landing. And that was despite the fact that they likely had ATC contact via their HF radio up until close to the end. The fact that the captain had guessed that they were somewhere on the L3 map could have been very useful information to share with the controllers, for example. Remember the golden rule of aviation? Aviate, navigate, communicate? Well, not a lot of that was being done here. Now, the pilots did discuss how they were going to execute the landing, but without actually looking for any guidance in their manuals, which would have likely given them some valuable pointers here. They decided to let the fuel completely run out and then glide towards the landing, concentrating on trying to minimize the vertical speed just before reaching the treetops. But with that plan, they also ignored some very important technical aspects, which will come into effect when the engines flame out, as you will soon come to see. At around 20:35 local time, the aircraft had flown for almost exactly 3 hours, and the fuel was now down to only 100 kilos. The pilots had started the auxiliary power unit, the APU, to provide electrical power, but of course that also required fuel in order to operate. The left engine, engine number 1 was the first to flame out, and when that happened, the pilots initiated their descent down from 8,500 feet. They were now flying on a heading of roughly 165 degrees, still following the indications of those false NDB signals, and only about 1 minute later, the number 2 engine also failed. That was then quickly followed by also the APU shutting down, which caused the entire aircraft to go almost completely dark, except for the standby instruments in the cockpit and the emergency exit lighting, which was powered by the batteries. The only thing that could now be heard was the wind rushing by outside and the cries from the terrified passengers in the back. Without any engine power, the aircraft descended with around 1,000 feet per minute, and the captain tried to keep the speed just above the stall speed as the trees started getting closer and closer below them. The first officer kept calling out altitudes and other parameters as they descended, and the captain soon asked for the flaps to be extended so that they could start slowing the aircraft down. When the first officer heard this, he selected first flaps 1, then flaps 5, but due to the lack of fuel in the tanks, which normally cools the hydraulic pumps, these pumps now started overheating. As soon as this was sent, the associated pump automatically switched off, but the system still continued to produce some pressure through the windmilling of the engines. But this shutdown also produced a hydraulic low pressure warning in the cockpit, and when the first officer saw this, he instinctively reached out and turned off the associated pump switch. Whilst that would have been the correct thing to do under normal circumstances, in this case it meant that the isolation valve of that pump opened up, which then completely removed the pressure from the hydraulic A system. This in turn meant that the flaps stopped in position 2 and could not be extended any further. Fortunately, the B pump switches were left alone, which meant that there was enough hydraulic power to drive the flight controls, which would have otherwise reverted over to something known as manual reversion, where pure muscle power is needed to move the rudder surfaces, and I can tell you that that is really heavy to do. During the last few meters over the trees, the speed was around 115 knots and the descent rate about 800 feet per minute. Since there was only battery power available, the landing lights were also inoperative, which meant that the jungle would have only been seen as a more intense blackness now coming up towards them. The pilots had no idea if they were going to land in water, trees, rocks or swampland. All they could do at this point was just to pray and continue to fly their aircraft. The landing gear was never lowered, and it's actually quite hard to say which impact it would have had if it was. Normally, it's always advised to extend the gear when landing on land, since it will absorb some of the impact forces, but that's when the engines are actually working. In a situation like this, the gear would have obviously created more drag, which would have caused a higher descent rate, and it's unclear how much they would have actually helped when impacting the treetops. But in any case, none of this was even discussed by the pilots. At time 2050, the Boeing 737 finally impacted the tops of the 30 to 40 meter high trees in the dense jungle canopy. This immediately tore off both wings and pounded the underside of the aircraft, causing the cabin floor to start deforming upwards. Without the wings, the cabin just continued sliding forward down past the trees until it hit the ground with a mighty thud, bringing everything to a complete stop within meters. The aircraft had now finally crashed, but this story was still far from over. The force of the deceleration during the crash was calculated to be close to 15 G, meaning that it was far beyond the maximum force that the aircraft had been certified to be able to take. This caused some of the passenger seats to release from their fittings and then fly forward into the forward bulkhead, killing 8 people immediately and seriously injuring others. But as through a miracle, 46 of the 54 people on board had initially survived the impact, and as the worst confusion started subsiding, they began trying to evacuate and also to help the injured. When the doors were opened, some of the emergency exit lights immediately deflated when activated, as they were pierced by sticks and trees outside, and some of the passengers who jumped out anyway then started running straight into the dark jungle, fearing an imminent explosion. But of course, a lucky byproduct of the fuel being completely exhausted was that there was now nothing really left that could explode. On top of the 8 passengers who had perished immediately, 4 more were critically injured, and they just needed to be brought to a hospital as quickly as possible. But how was that going to be possible? No one knew where they were. The air traffic controllers had since many hours by this point stopped all traffic that was going into their intended destination, Belém, in order to facilitate their eventual landing. And they had also, on the captain's request, reopened the airport at Caracas, but there had been no signs of the aircraft anywhere. The formal search and rescue campaign started later during that same night, when it was decided that the aircraft must have run out of fuel by then. But where should they even begin to search? There was no sign of the aircraft, and the pilots had not given the controllers any clue about where they actually were. At the same time, in the jungle, the crew and the surviving passengers had tried to help the ones who were still trapped in their collapsed chairs. The captain was conscious and was helping to lead the effort, but the first officer had slammed his head into a metal part of his seat rest and was still unconscious at that point. Now, everyone tried to do whatever they could, but with the limited light and medicines available, there was very little that could be done during the first few hours. As daylight came, the captain managed to remove the emergency locator transmitter, the ELT, which is a small device designed to send out an SOS pulse on the emergency frequencies 121.5 and 243 MHz. But unfortunately, this ELT was not of a type that was activated by G-forces. Instead, it had been designed to be switched on only after a ditching in water and therefore had to be submerged in liquid. This meant that the passengers and crew now had to use whatever little liquid they could find, from everything including melted ice from the bar and their own urine, to try and submerge the device in a bucket to activate it. And after a while, it actually worked. One of the passengers were carrying a Walkman with them, and with the help of that, they could hear that the pulses were being transmitted in the form of interference in his headphones. But by now, they also had another problem: lack of water. You see, even though the rainforest is thought of as a place with abundant water, that's not always the case, so they now had to try to do something about that. Luckily though, it turned out that one of the survivors was a young forest surveyor, and with his help a small expedition was sent out into the jungle and soon found a small stream of fresh water that was safe to drink. And some of the passengers actually went there to swim a little bit as well. Meanwhile, the search was now in full swing, and satellites had been activated in order to listen out for the emergency pulses that should be sent out by the ELT. Soon, faint signals could be picked up, which led the search and rescue teams far down to the southwest of the aircraft's expected flight path. But even though search aircraft was sent out over that area, nothing was found on the first day of searches. After the second night in the wreckage, the passengers decided that they would need to try and find help themselves. Another expedition, consisting of 4 passengers, was put together to start walking, and to their surprise, they only needed to move a few kilometers through the jungle before reaching open land which had been slashed and burned into farmland. There, they found a farmer who, quite shocked, explained that he had no contact with anyone on the outside, but he thought that a neighbor a few kilometers away might have a ham radio. He took one of the passengers in his car and then drove him over there, and together with that neighbor, they now started transmitting their fantastic story out over the airwaves. Initially though, no one believed him, so he had to keep repeating his ticket number numerous times until someone finally took him seriously. Once that happened, the whole rescue effort then quickly converged onto the site, and with the help of those 4 survivors, the crash site was soon located from the air. This happened 2 days after the accident and 1,100 kilometers southwest of where they should have been. A helicopter airlifted rescuers to the site, but since the light was then quickly fading, the survivors had to endure yet another night in the wild, but this time with food, blankets and medicine available. Another 3 passengers had unfortunately succumbed to their injuries at this point, and one, who was later airlifted to the hospital, also didn't make it, meaning that 12 persons in total died as a result of this accident. But miraculously, the other 42 passengers and crew had survived, not only the crash, but also over 48 hours lost in the jungle. The investigation started immediately, and it was soon made clear that this accident had been caused by a combination of a colossal navigational mistake by the pilots, partially due to the unclear flight plan. This had then been followed by various human factors-induced mistakes and decisions who caused the pilots to fixate on their objective of reaching Belém rather than trying to make up a new plan, climbing to a higher altitude and make full use of air traffic control and nav aids. This was a true testament to how easy it is to dig yourself deeper into a hole when the right thing to do is to get out, look around with a fresh perspective and then start all over again. Obviously, this type of event would likely not have happened today with the availability of GPS, extensive radar coverage and about 1,000 other tools, but the principle stays the same. Sometimes it's way better to ignore the sunk cost, just admit to a mistake and then focus on a solution instead. There were several recommendations coming out of this accident, the most important of which probably was the mandatory inclusion of a G-activated emergency locator transmitter on the aircraft and obviously navigation and CRM training for all Varig pilots, plus the change of that 4-digit course description in their flight plans. Now I want to give a special shout out to Admiral Cloudberg, who helped me find a translated version of the original Portuguese final report, as well as her excellent article about this accident. I will link to her work in the description here below and advise you to check it out. She is really great. Also, watch these videos next and join my Patreon crew if you want to discuss this accident in more detail directly with me and the rest of the Patreons in our next Zoom hangout. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.